7 years with someone teaches you their patterns. The way she hums when she's actually in a good mood versus when she's just performing it. The way she tilts her head when she wants something. The difference between a real laugh and the one she uses at dinner parties. I knew Linda Summers better than I knew most things in my life. That's probably why it took me longer than it should have to name what was happening between us. We met at a mutual friend's backyard gathering in the summer. She was direct, sharp, funny in that dry way that doesn't need a punchline. I was working as a process analyst back then, still building toward the industrial engineering position I've had for the past 4 years. We moved in together after 18 months. Married 2 years after that. Minneapolis winters, a rented house on the south side, 2 decent cars in the driveway. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a headline. Just 2 people building something together. Except somewhere in the last year or so, Linda stopped building. She didn't leave. She didn't cheat. She just pulled back. Small at first. Less conversation at dinner. Less contact on the couch. I'd reach for her hand, and she'd shift position. I told myself it was stress, work, seasonal mood. I kept covering the distance. Kept showing up. That's what you do. But the pattern got clearer over time. Affection became conditional. Touch became something that had to be earned through the right mood, the right moment, the right version of me that she decided was acceptable that day. I'd come home from a 12-hour shift at the plant. Bring her something from Walgreens because I remembered she mentioned running low on something, and she'd say thanks without looking up from her phone. But if I didn't do it, there was a shift in her energy the rest of the evening. A quiet performance of disappointment. And then there was the subject of kids. I won't pretend I didn't notice. Every time I brought it up, not pushy, not demanding, just opening a door the way couples are supposed to, her face did this thing. A micro-expression gone in half a second. Eyes down. Topic redirect. We'll talk about it later. Later never came. I stopped pushing after a while, but I didn't stop noticing. The guys at work had been joking about it for months. Stephen Kelly, who's been married 8 years, has this whole bit about the toll booth marriage, where suddenly everything costs something and the rates keep going up. He'd say it laughing, but I always caught something underneath the laugh. I used to think his marriage was just different from mine. I used to think Linda and I had something more solid. The night it ended, not the marriage, not yet, but the version of me that was willing to keep absorbing it, was a Wednesday in January. Minneapolis cold, the kind that makes the windows contract overnight. I'd gotten home around 7. Made dinner because she had a long day. Set the table. Poured 2 glasses of Josh Cellars because it was the one she liked. We ate, talked about nothing in particular, the kind of conversation that fills space without saying much. After we cleaned up, I put my hand on her waist. Nothing aggressive, nothing urgent, just the way you reach for your person at the end of a day. She stepped back, turned to face me, and said, with the same tone she'd used to explain a parking policy, "Intimacy is a privilege, not your right." I stood there for a moment, didn't raise my voice, didn't ask where that came from. I just looked at her, the woman I'd spent 7 years building a life with, and understood clearly and completely that something had shifted in this arrangement. Not inside me, in the arrangement itself. I nodded once, said, "Okay," and that was the last night I tried. I want to be precise about what changed, because it wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a confrontation. It was more like a contractor realizing the client stopped paying and deciding to stop showing up to the job site. If intimacy was a privilege she was choosing to withhold, then my effort was a privilege she hadn't earned. No more coffee brought to her side of the bed on Saturday mornings. No more stopping at CVS because I remembered she was almost out of something. No more checking in during the day just to check in. No more filling the silence with warmth. She'd stopped returning the things I've been doing automatically for years, because that's how I understood partnership. I stopped doing them deliberately, quietly, without announcement. She didn't notice right away, but she would. The first week, she didn't say anything. I wasn't sure if she noticed or if she was just waiting for me to go back to normal. I didn't go back to normal. The routine at home became functional. I got up, made my own coffee, went to work, came back, handled my half of things around the house, ate, slept, polite when spoken to, present when needed. But the small infrastructure I'd been quietly running, the thoughtful gestures, the checking in, the warmth I'd been extending without expectation, that was gone. I wasn't cold. I was just accurate. I gave exactly what the situation had shown me it warranted. Linda moved through the first few days without visible reaction. She had her routine, her phone, her calls with Maggie Clark that sometimes ran 40 minutes. I didn't ask what they talked about. I already had a general idea. Maggie had been feeding Linda some version of, "You need to prioritize your own needs" for at least 2 years. Good advice in theory. Corrosive in practice when it becomes an excuse to stop showing up for the person sleeping next to you. Thursday that week, Steven texted asking if I was coming to the free house after the shift review. I said yes. The free house sits on Washington Avenue, the kind of place that fills up with engineers and project managers around 5:30, because the beer is good and nobody's performing anything. Steven was already there with Adam Neal and Leonard Way from Structural. I pulled up a stool, ordered a pint of their house IPA, and for the next 2 hours talked about everything except whatever was happening in my house. Inventory bottlenecks, the Vikings' offensive line, whether the new plant software was actually going to reduce downtime, or just create 3 new categories of downtime with better names. At some point, Leonard left, and it was just Steven and me at the end of the bar. He refilled his glass and said, without much setup, "You look like a man who made a decision recently." I looked at him. "What does that look like?" "Calmer than you should be," he said. "Men who haven't made the decision yet look tired. You just look settled." I didn't confirm or deny anything. I just said the beer was good, and he laughed, and we moved on. But he wasn't wrong. By the second week, Linda started noticing the gaps. Not in a dramatic way at first. More like she'd walk into the kitchen on a Saturday morning and pause for half a second when there was no coffee waiting. She was capable of making her own coffee, obviously, but that pause said everything. She'd noticed the absence without being prepared for it. I was working on the Audi in the driveway one Sunday afternoon, just basic maintenance, when our neighbor Gage Cannon came over and leaned against the fence. Gage is the kind of person who talks carefully, like he weighs what he's about to say before it comes out. He watched me work for a minute and then said, "Haven't seen you two out back together in a while." "Busy stretch," I said. He nodded slowly. "Linda seems like she's been in her head lately." I didn't respond to that directly. I handed him a wrench to hold while I repositioned, and he held it without pushing the conversation further. But later, I thought about what he said. Gage wasn't wrong either. Linda was in her head. The question was whether she was figuring out why, or just waiting for me to dissolve the tension the way I always had before. She tried the second option first. That same evening, she came and sat on the arm of the couch while I was watching something. Close enough to be a gesture. I acknowledged her and kept watching. She sat there for a few minutes and then got up and went to the kitchen. I heard the Pepsi can open. The quiet that followed had a different texture than the quiet from 2 weeks ago. Less settled, more aware. The following Tuesday, she called Maggie again. I could hear pieces of it from the hallway. Not the words, just the tone. At some point, the tone shifted, less venting, more questioning. I didn't stand there and listen. I went to the garage and finished the project I'd been putting off for 3 weeks. That night at dinner, she asked conversationally how things were going at work. I told her briefly, accurately, asked the same back. She answered. We ate, cleared the table. No coffee the next morning. No text during the day. No stopping anywhere on the way home. She was starting to understand that the version of this marriage she'd been operating in, the one where his effort was a given and her engagement was optional, had a different set of conditions now. I hadn't announced that. I hadn't delivered a speech. I just stopped pretending the arrangement was working when it clearly wasn't. And Linda Summers, whether she was ready to admit it or not, was beginning to feel the weight of exactly what she'd been taking for granted. It was a Saturday morning, end of the third week, when Linda brought up kids. Not carefully. Not the way you ease into a conversation you've been avoiding for months. She just set down her mug and said, I've been thinking about the family thing. What you mentioned before. I was at the counter going through some project files I brought home. I looked up at her and waited. I think maybe I wasn't being fair about it, she said. Every time you brought it up, I kind of shut it down. I didn't mean to make you feel like it wasn't something I wanted to talk about. I closed the folder. What changed? She looked at me. What do you mean? You've changed the subject every time I brought it up for the past 8 months. So I'm asking what changed. She didn't have a clean answer for that. She started one and adjusted it mid-sentence, which told me she hadn't fully worked out what she actually wanted to say. What she landed on was something about being in a better headspace now, more open to the conversation. I nodded once and said, okay, when you've thought it through more, let me know. I picked up the folder and went back to work. She stayed at the table for a while. I could feel her trying to read the room, trying to figure out if that was a door opening or closing. The answer was neither. It was a standard I was holding. If we were going to talk about having children, it wasn't going to happen because she'd suddenly decided to be generous with a conversation she'd been withholding for the better part of a year. It was going to happen when she actually had something to say. That evening, she tried again differently. She came and sat beside me on the couch, not on the arm this time, actually beside me, and put her hand on my arm. I didn't move away. I also didn't lean in. I just let it be what it was and kept my attention where it was. She said quietly, "Are we okay?" And that's where I put the remote down and turned to face her, because that question deserved a direct answer. "You told me intimacy was a privilege I hadn't earned," I said. "So I stopped trying to earn something in my own marriage. That's where we are." She opened her mouth, closed it. Then, "I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" Silence. The kind that confirms the person doesn't have a better version of what they said. "Linda," I kept my voice even, "you've been treating this marriage like a performance review for about a year. Affection on good behavior, warmth when I meet some standard I was never told about." I kept adjusting, kept showing up, kept filling the gaps because I thought that's what you do when you're building something with someone. Then I realized I was the only one building. So I stopped. "That's not. I haven't been doing that. You've been doing exactly that." No anger in it. Just a plain statement of a man who'd had enough time to be certain. And the thing about kids, every time I opened that door, you looked at me like I was asking for something unreasonable. You never said no, but you made sure I understood the answer was no until further notice. Her jaw tightened. "I just needed time to." 8 months isn't time," I said. 8 months is a position. She looked away. Her hands were in her lap, fingers pressing together. "I'm not doing this to punish you," I said. "I'm doing this because the version of this marriage where I carry all the effort and you manage all the access stopped being acceptable to me. That's the conversation. We can do something with it, or we can keep sitting here." She didn't respond right away. She got up after a minute, went to the kitchen, ran the water, came back, and stood in the doorway. "I hear you," she said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a defense either. It was something in between. The sound of someone who'd been given an accurate picture of themselves and didn't know yet what to do with it. I picked the remote back up. Good. She went to bed before me that night. I sat in the quiet of the living room with the TV off after a while. Just the Minneapolis cold pressing against the windows and the hum of the house. I wasn't satisfied exactly. Satisfaction wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time in a year, the actual situation between us had been named out loud. By me, clearly, without apology. That mattered. What happened next was up to her. The week after that conversation, Linda called Maggie. That part wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how long the call took and the fact that it ended with Linda sitting at the kitchen table for 20 minutes afterward doing nothing. No phone, no TV, just sitting. I didn't ask about it. I poured a glass of water, nodded in her direction, and went to the garage. I found out later, not because she told me directly, but because pieces of it came through over the following days, that the call hadn't gone the way Linda expected. She'd gone in looking for the usual framing. She needed space. She was entitled to her own emotional pace. The pressure around intimacy and kids was coming from an unhealthy place. Maggie had provided that framing before reliably, but this time, apparently, it landed differently. Linda had quoted what I said, the part about carrying all the effort while she managed all the access. And Maggie had gone quiet for a moment before saying something like, "That's actually a pretty fair description of what you've been describing to me for the past year, just from the other side. That's not the kind of thing a person processes quickly, especially when you've been operating under the assumption that your perspective was the correct one." At the plant Thursday, Stephen and I were walking the floor during a monitoring check when he mentioned offhand that he and his wife had gone through something similar about 4 years back. He said it the way he says most things, no fanfare, like he's just reading from a report. "What changed it?" I asked. "She stopped getting the version of me that absorbed everything and kept going," he said. "Took her about 6 weeks to realize she actually missed the guy she'd been taking for granted. Took me longer to trust it wasn't just panic." I looked at him. "Did you trust it eventually?" "Yeah," he said. "Once she started showing it in actions instead of just saying the right things. That's the only version that counts." We moved on to the next checkpoint. I didn't say anything else about it, but I filed that away. Linda's first actual gesture came that Friday evening. I came home to find she'd made dinner, not ordered something, not thrown together whatever was easiest. She'd cooked the kind of meal that takes an hour and requires paying attention. She had Josh Cellars on the counter already open, the way I usually did it. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She was plating things with her back to me and said, without turning around, "Figured you'd be tired after the long week." I set my bag down. "Looks good." We ate together. The conversation was careful on both sides, not stiff but measured. She asked about the project I'd been managing. I answered in full sentences, not the clipped responses I'd been giving for weeks. She didn't push for more than that. She seemed to understand, without it being stated, that she was operating on thinner margin than she was used to, and that performing openness wasn't the same as demonstrating it. After dinner, she cleaned up without being asked. Small thing. She'd stopped doing it consistently about a year ago. Somehow it had migrated into my column along with most other things. I noticed. I didn't comment on it. The weekend, Gage came by again, this time to return a tool he'd borrowed months back. He handed it over and caught my eye in that way he has, like he's clocking something he won't say directly. "Whatever you did," he said quietly, "seems like it's working." I gave him a look. I didn't do anything. He smiled slightly. "Exactly." He headed back across the yard, and I stood there a second before going inside. That Sunday morning, for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember, I woke up to the smell of coffee already made. I came downstairs and Linda was at the table with her own mug, a second one waiting on the counter. She didn't make a production of it. Didn't look at me waiting for credit. She was reading something on her phone and looked up briefly when I came in. "Morning," she said. "Morning." I picked up the mug. It was a small thing, but small things are where patterns live. And this one ran in the opposite direction from where we'd been for a year. I drank my coffee and watched the snow come down outside the kitchen window and didn't say anything about it, because it wasn't yet the kind of gesture that required a response. It was the kind that required watching. 3 weeks of consistent gestures. That's what Linda put in. Not grand declarations, not a single dramatic conversation asking for a clean slate, just steady, quiet effort, the kind I recognize because I've been doing it myself for the better part of the year before I stopped. Dinner twice more. Coffee on the mornings, she was up first. One evening, she asked if I wanted company while I worked on something in the garage. And when I said sure, she pulled up a stool and sat there for an hour, not filling the silence unnecessarily, just being present. That one landed differently than the other gestures. It was the kind of thing you only do when you actually want to be somewhere, not when you're running a strategy. I noticed all of it. I kept my response measured, not cold. I wasn't trying to punish her. I'd said that and meant it, but I wasn't going to pretend 3 weeks of effort closed the account on a year of the opposite. Trust doesn't rebuild on a schedule. It rebuilds on evidence, and I was still collecting it. This Saturday, she suggested Minnehaha Falls. I didn't hesitate long before saying yes. It was February, which meant the falls were partially frozen, the kind of scene that looks like something manufactured for a calendar. We'd been there twice before, once the fall after we met, once the summer before we got married. She knew what she was doing suggesting it. I knew what she was doing. Neither of us said that out loud. We drove down in the Audi with the heat running and a half-finished Pepsi in the cup holder she'd grabbed from 7-Eleven on the way. The roads were clear enough. She had a playlist going, nothing that required comment, just something to fill the space. The park was quiet in the way Minneapolis gets on cold weekend mornings. A few other people on the path, breath visible, boots on packed snow. We walked the trail toward the falls without hurrying. She had her hands in her coat pockets. I had mine. We weren't touching, and neither of us pushed for it. Standing at the overlook, the falls half-locked in ice, she said, "I used to think about this place a lot when things were good." I looked at the ice formations running down the rock face. "What made you stop?" She was quiet for a moment. I think I got comfortable in the wrong way. Like, I stopped looking at what was actually in front of me and started just assuming it would stay. I didn't respond immediately. The wind came off the gorge, and she pulled her collar up. "I'm not asking you to forget any of it," she said. "I know that's not how it works. I want you to know that I see it now. What I was doing, what I was turning this into. Took you a while," I said. "Not cruel, just accurate." "I know." We stood there another minute. A couple passed behind us on the path, their dog pulling ahead on the leash. Normal Saturday, normal world going on around, 2 people standing at the edge of something that could go either way. On the walk back, I asked her directly, "When Maggie told you what she told you, that what I described matched what you'd been describing to her, what did you do with that?" She looked at the path, argued with it for about 2 days, then stopped arguing. "Why'd you stop?" "Because I kept trying to find the version where I wasn't the one who let things get here, and I couldn't find it." She paused. Every time I tried to build a case, I'd remember something. The kids' conversation. The way you'd come home, and I'd barely look up. The coffee thing. She shook her head slightly. "It adds up." I let that sit without filling it in. We got back to the car. She got on the passenger side, and I started the engine and let it warm up. Before I pulled out, she said, "I don't expect things to just go back." "Good," I said. "Because they won't. Not to what they were." That version had problems we were both ignoring. She turned to look at me. "So what version are we going to?" I checked the mirrors, pulled out of the lot slowly onto the snow-packed road. "That depends on whether what you've been doing the last few weeks is who you actually are now," I said, "or just who you're being until you think the pressure's off." She didn't answer that. She looked out the passenger window at the bare trees going past. But she didn't deflect it either. Didn't try to reassure me with the easy version. She just let it be the question it was. That More than anything she'd said that day, told me something worth knowing. Another 2 weeks passed before we had the actual conversation. Not the one at Minnehaha. Not the one on the couch in January. The one that covered everything. The one we should have had a year ago. It was a Tuesday evening. Nothing special about the day. Linda had made dinner again. We ate, cleaned up together, and instead of splitting off to opposite ends of the house the way we'd been doing for months, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at me in a way that said she wasn't going anywhere until we talked. I got 2 glasses of water and sat across from her. I want to explain something, she said, not to make excuses, just so you understand where I was. I told her to go ahead. What came out wasn't a rehearsed speech. It was scattered in places, corrected itself midway through, went back and picked up things she'd skipped. She talked about a period about 18 months ago when she'd started feeling like the shape of her life had narrowed, the routine, the same city, the same walls, and she didn't know how to name what she was missing, so she turned it outward. Made it about the marriage. Made it about me not doing enough of something she couldn't even define. The kids questioned. She said she'd been genuinely afraid, not of having children, but of what it would mean for the version of herself she was still trying to figure out. And instead of saying that, she just closed the door and hoped I'd stop knocking. The intimacy thing, she said, and then stopped for a second. I knew when I said it that it was wrong. I don't know why I said it like that. I think I wanted you to push back. I think I needed to see if you still had something to fight for. And when you didn't fight, when you just said okay and walked away, that scared me more than an argument would have. I sat with that for a moment. You wanted me to chase? I said, I think so. Yeah. And when you didn't, I had to start asking why. She looked at the table, and the answer kept coming back to me. I told her my side of it plainly, not to hurt her with it. I wasn't interested in scoring anything, but because if we were going to rebuild something, it needed a foundation that included the truth about what had actually happened. I told her what a year of adjusted effort felt like. The slow recalibration of always trying to meet a standard that kept moving. The kids' conversation. How many times I'd opened that door and watched her face close before I'd finished the sentence. The night in January, and what it had clarified for me. She listened. She didn't interrupt to defend herself. Didn't correct my framing. She just listened the way someone listens when they've already done the hard work of accepting that they're going to hear something true about themselves. When I finished, she said, I'm sorry. Not the version of, I'm sorry you felt that way. The version of, I'm sorry because I did those things and they caused damage. That distinction mattered. I acknowledged it. So what does that leave us? She said. It leaves us here, I said, with a marriage that has a chance of being better than what it was if we're both honest about what that requires. No more managed access. No more one person carrying the weight of maintaining the connection while the other person decides whether to show up that day. That's not a marriage. That's a lease agreement with bad terms. Something close to a smile crossed her face at that last part. She shook her head slightly. Okay, she said. Equal weight. Equal weight, I said. The following weeks were different in a way that's hard to describe without making it sound simpler than it was. It wasn't a sudden return to the early years. It was something more deliberate than that. 2 people consciously choosing the thing they'd been carelessly neglecting. We talked more, not about problems, just talked the way we used to when the default was connection instead of distance. She booked a weekend in late March, a cabin 2 hours north, said she wanted a change of scenery that wasn't the same 4 walls of a house where we'd accumulated a year of bad patterns. I thought that was a good idea. We went. Stephen noticed at work before I said anything. He just raised an eyebrow one afternoon and said, settled again. And I told him things were moving in the right direction. He nodded, once like that confirmed something, and went back to his clipboard. Gage saw us in the backyard together one Saturday morning in early April. Linda had brought coffee out, the 2 of us standing in the thin spring sun, and he waved from his side of the fence without comment. That was enough. The morning Linda came downstairs holding a CVS bag and sat on the kitchen counter without saying anything. I was reading something on my phone. I looked at the bag, then at her face. Her expression was the kind that tries to stay neutral and doesn't quite manage it. She reached into the bag and set a pregnancy test on the counter, face up. 2 lines. I put the phone down. She said, I took 3. They all say the same thing. I stood up and crossed the kitchen, and she met me halfway. I held her for a long time, and neither of us said anything for a while. And the Minneapolis morning came through the window, quiet and ordinary, like it had no idea what had just landed in the middle of it. When we finally stepped back, she looked at me and said, You still want this? I've wanted this for 2 years, I said. She nodded, eyes wet. No performance in it. We stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, not making plans yet, Not talking about logistics or timelines or what came next, just standing in the fact of it. This thing we nearly let slip through carelessness and pride, a year of wrong patterns, and understanding, both of us, how close we'd come to a completely different ending. We didn't get that ending. We got this one. And this one, built on what we'd both finally been honest enough to say, was worth every uncomfortable week it took to get here. No relationship survives long-term when only one person is building it. Calvin didn't walk out. He just stopped being the only one holding everything together. And that silence said more than any argument ever could. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do isn't fight harder. It's stop carrying what was never meant to be carried alone. If this story made you think about something in your own life, drop in the comments. You're probably not the only one. Well, that's where our video comes to an end. I really hope you have enjoyed your time here. Don't forget to leave a like, your comment, and also subscribe to our channel.